She used to hide them. Every mark, every line, every quiet reminder of where she had once broken. To her, scars were proof of weakness, of failure, of the moments she wasn't enough. So she covered them with makeup, with smiles, with stories that sounded fine but felt false. She learned to dress her wounds in silence, and she told herself that strong women don't bleed where anyone can see. But Grace has never been afraid of blood. Grace sits with you in the mess, unflinching, and whispers, "I was there when it happened. I never left." It took her years to understand that. Years of pretending her healing had to look beautiful to count. Years of trying to make her story sound inspiring, when all she really wanted was to stop hurting. She thought healing would erase the past, but it didn't. It revealed it. The cracks, the fractures, the fragile places she had prayed no one would notice. They became the very spaces where the light began to seep through. And that light, fragile and fierce, was the proof that she hadn't just survived. She had been remade. There's a kind of beauty you only find after breaking. It doesn't shine like glass. It glows like embers. Quiet, persistent, alive. She learned that her scars were not the ruins of who she used to be. They were the bridges that carried her to who she was becoming. Every line on her skin, every ache in her memory, was a sentence in the story Grace was still writing. But she didn't see it that way at first. For a long time she hated the way her heart felt heavy when old memories returned. She blamed herself for still feeling pain, and she thought that if she really believed, she'd be over it by now. But healing, she would discover, isn't a moment. It's a slow unraveling, a sacred process where even the pain has purpose. One evening she found herself staring at the reflection in the mirror again. Not the kind that checks for flaws, but the kind that searches for traces of the woman she used to be. The room was dim, the air still, and for the first time she didn't look away. Her scars were there, visible, honest, undeniable, and somehow they didn't look ugly anymore. They looked alive. It was then she realized that maybe scars weren't meant to be hidden. Maybe they were meant to be seen, not as proof of what broke, but of what endured. The light didn't erase them. It made them shine, and that was the miracle. Not that she'd been spared from pain, but that she'd been seen through it. There's a certain kind of holiness in what survives the fire. Not the untouched, but the transformed. Not the unscarred, but the redeemed. And if she could go back, she wouldn't ask to erase the wounds anymore. She'd ask to remember them. Because now she knew. Every scar was a place where Grace had met her, where love had refused to let go. So if you're listening tonight, and you're still tracing the edges of your own pain, hear me. Your scars are not your shame. They are your story. They are the evidence that even when life tore through you, light still found a way in. And maybe that's all faith really is. Not pretending you're whole, but daring to believe that broken can still be beautiful. That redemption doesn't come to erase what happened, but to turn the wound into a window, a place where heaven can be seen through human skin. So, take a breath. You don't have to keep hiding what hurt you. You don't have to cover the cracks, because sometimes the light you're praying for is already shining between them. And if these words touch something raw in you, if you've ever felt too broken to be beautiful again, stay. This space, this story, this channel, it's for you. For the woman still learning to love her reflection, and the light between her scars. Subscribe, not for perfection, but for peace, for reminders that even in the places that ache the most, Grace is still writing something radiant. There are some wounds that don't disappear just because time has passed. They quiet down, yes, they stop screaming, but every now and then, you feel them pulse beneath the surface, like an echo of something that still remembers being broken. She thought she'd moved on. She told herself she was healed. But there were nights when memory still found her, and the ache returned, soft, subtle, but real. It wasn't that she hadn't forgiven. It wasn't that she didn't believe. It's just that healing doesn't erase history. It teaches you how to hold it differently. The wound wasn't open anymore, but it still breathed when she remembered what she lost. She'd trace the scars on her soul and think, shouldn't this hurt less by now? But maybe the pain wasn't a punishment. Maybe it was proof that she had loved deeply. She began to see that God never promised her a life without scars. He promised presence, and presence meant that even when the ache lingered, she wasn't alone in it. There were days she still felt raw, mornings when a song, a scent, a word would reopen something tender. And in those moments, she'd stop fighting it. She'd close her eyes, breathe through it, and whisper, "Even this belongs to you." It was a different kind of faith, not loud, not polished, but honest. Faith that didn't demand understanding, only trust, because she'd learned that the goal wasn't to forget the pain. It was to see what the pain had taught her. That love was still worth it. That softness was still strength. That her story didn't end where it broke. Some nights, she would sit quietly with her hand over her heart and feel the faint rhythm beneath her palm. That steady reminder that she was still here. That life continued, even after everything that tried to end it. And she realized, maybe the wound still ached, not because she hadn't healed, but because she was still growing around it. Because grace doesn't remove the ache, it redeems it. And somewhere in that realization, she stopped asking, "When will this stop hurting?" and started praying, "Teach me what it's trying to say." And that's when the wound, still tender and imperfect, began to glow. Not as a mark of pain, but as the very place where light began to live. Healing never looked the way she expected. It didn't come as a clean ending or a sudden light. It came as hands, gentle, steady, scarred themselves, reaching into her mess without hesitation. For a long time, she thought God healed from a distance, from some holy place untouched by sorrow. But now she knew his hands carried their own scars. He didn't stand above her pain. He entered it. There were nights when she still flinched at her reflection. She saw what had been broken and thought maybe he would too. But he never looked away. Grace, she realized, didn't wear gloves. It wasn't afraid of the blood or the fragments. It came close enough to touch the wound without fear of being stained. Close enough to whisper, "I still call this holy." At first she resisted the tenderness. She was used to fixing herself, to hiding what hurt, to pretending her heart wasn't as fragile as it was. She'd spent years mastering composure, confusing control with healing, and silence with strength. But those hands, patient, deliberate, didn't ask her to be strong. They just held her, and in that holding something inside her began to loosen. The walls she'd built for survival began to crack, and through those cracks, the light entered. Healing wasn't about forgetting what had been broken. It was about seeing beauty in what remained. The same hands that shaped the stars were now tracing the outline of her scars, not to erase them, but to name them beloved. Each mark became a testimony, not of failure, but of faithfulness. Of a God who doesn't fix from afar, but mends from within. There were moments she wanted to pull away again. Old habits whispered, "You're too much, too fragile, too late," but those hands stayed, unmoving, unwavering. They didn't tighten their grip. They simply refused to let go. And she began to realize that real healing wasn't about feeling strong. It was about finally feeling safe. She learned that love doesn't rush the process. It doesn't shame the ache or silence the grief. It waits, with open hands, until you're ready to believe you're still worthy of touch. And the more she let herself be held, the less she feared the broken parts of her story, because she understood now. They weren't proof of where she had fallen, but proof of where she had been found. And when she finally lifted her hands, trembling, unsure, and laid them over her heart, she could almost feel his hands beneath hers, steady, warm, eternal. The wound was still there, yes, but so was the healer, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of either. That night, she fell asleep with her palms open, no longer clinging, no longer covering, just resting. Because healing wasn't something she had to hold on to. At first she thought the light was temporary, a moment of clarity after the storm, something she would lose once the world became loud again. But it stayed. Even in the quiet mornings and the restless nights, it stayed. Not like fire consuming everything, but like breath, gentle, constant, alive. There was a time she believed the light only came to the deserving, to the ones who prayed harder, tried harder, kept it all together. But this light, it came for the undone. It came for the ones still shaking from what they survived. It came for her, the woman who thought she had lost too much to be worth reaching for. The light didn't demand perfection. It didn't fix what was broken in a flash. It simply lingered, in the spaces between her fears and her faith, in the corners of her room where she once wept, in the quiet rhythm of her own breathing. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was loyal. And loyalty, she learned, is what love looks like when it stops needing proof. Some days she forgot it was there. She'd get caught in old thoughts, reach for the weight she no longer had to carry. She'd question again, fall back into overthinking. But every time the light would find her. Through a verse she'd long forgotten, through laughter she didn't expect, through the steady peace that slipped in when she stopped trying to control everything. And she realized the light didn't visit her life. It moved in. It didn't knock. It just stayed, as if it had always belonged there, as if it had always known she would one day need its warmth. She stopped asking why it stayed and started asking how she ever lived without it. Now she began to see it everywhere. In the morning sunlight glancing off the sink, in her reflection, softer now, the same woman but lighter somehow. Even her scars caught the light differently. What once felt like reminders of pain now shimmered like rivers of gold, where heaven had poured itself through the cracks. And there was peace in that, in knowing she didn't have to chase the light anymore. She didn't have to hold on tight, afraid it might leave, because real light doesn't come and go. It becomes. It roots itself inside you until even your shadows glow. She used to think the miracle was that she found it, but now she knew. The miracle was that it never stopped finding her. That even when she closed her heart, it waited. That even when she turned away, it followed, because grace never leaves what it loves. And this light, this quiet, steady, unrelenting light, had loved her all along. She never thought beauty could live in the same space as pain. For years, she believed they were opposites, that to be whole, she had to erase everything that had once hurt. But the more she healed, the more she saw that beauty and sorrow had always walked together. And somehow, they both belonged. There were still days when her heart ached without warning, when memory brushed past her like a ghost. But this time, the ache didn't destroy her. It deepened her. Because she had learned that pain can coexist with peace, and that sometimes the most sacred things bloom in the soil of what once broke you. She used to want a new story, one without the cracks, without the questions, without the scars. But she doesn't want that anymore. Now she understands that every scar is a sentence. Every tear was a word. And together they tell the story of a God who never walked away. Her pain had become her proof. Not that she had suffered, but that she had been seen. She began to notice beauty in places she once avoided. In the old journal pages still stained with tears, in the songs that once made her cry, but now made her feel alive, grateful, awake. She started thanking God for things she never thought she could, for endings that hurt, for seasons that stripped her bare, for moments that made her start again. Because now she knew, without those moments, she would have never met grace like this. It wasn't the kind of beauty you post or photograph. It was quiet. It was the beauty of forgiveness, of breathing without fear, of looking back and realizing she didn't need to hate her past to love her present. It was the beauty of still being here, softer, wiser, still open to love. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned gold, she looked at her hands. The same hands that once trembled, the same hands that once covered her face in shame, and she smiled. Because now, when she saw her reflection, she didn't see brokenness. She saw becoming. Not the pain that once defined her, but the light that now lived through her. And in that moment, she whispered softly, "Thank you for what stayed." The laughter, the lessons, the love that didn't leave. Because even after everything was stripped away, something beautiful remained. Something stronger, quieter, truer. The kind of beauty that doesn't fade. Because it isn't built on what was perfect, but on what survived. She used to pray for her scars to fade. She thought that if they disappeared, maybe she could finally move on. Start over as someone untouched, someone unmarked, someone new. But now she knows. The scars were never her shame. They were the proof that she didn't die there. Every line, every mark, every silent ache became a map. A way to trace where grace had walked beside her. And she realized that maybe God never meant for her to forget. Maybe remembrance was the miracle, because what she remembers, He redeems. And what He redeems, He turns to light. The light that once frightened her now feels like home. It doesn't demand she be perfect. It just asks her to be honest. It doesn't erase the pain. It redeems its meaning. And now, when she runs her fingers over her scars, she doesn't feel sorrow anymore. She feels awe, because somehow, even there, especially there, He stayed. She still has bad days, still moments when the ache whispers its old language. But now, instead of hiding, she breathes. She lets the light touch every part of her again. Because healing isn't about never bleeding. It's about never bleeding alone. And she knows now, she never did. Her story isn't one of perfection. It's one of presence. Of divine hands that never stopped holding her together, even when she was too broken to notice. Of a love that looked at the ruins and saw a cathedral instead, a holy place, not because it was flawless, but because it was filled with light. And that's the mystery of grace. It never asks you to hide what hurt. It asks you to lift it into the light, because the places that once defined your pain can become the very places where others find their healing. Her scars became her testimony, her story her offering, her light, her legacy. So tonight, if you're listening with quiet tears on your cheeks, if you still see yourself in the mirror and wonder if the light could ever reach you, it already has. It's there, waiting, resting between your scars, patient as heaven, soft as mercy. And if these words found you tonight, if they reminded you that broken things can still glow, then stay with us. This space, this channel, is for the women learning to live in the light again. So subscribe, not for perfection but for peace. Because here, we don't hide our scars. We let them shine. Because sometimes, the most sacred light is the one that never leaves the places we thought were ruined. It's the light that stayed,